Happy New Year, or if you're watching this later on, then welcome. I played a bunch of video games this year of all shapes and sizes, ranging from old ones, games I've already played many times before, and certainly even a couple that actually came out in 2025. Today I want to talk about some of the games I played for the first time in 2025, and give some thoughts on them. Who knows, you might want to give some of them a try. I got a good selection of games back in Christmas of 2024, but didn't play all of them before that year ended. At the beginning of the year 2025, I played one of the games that I also got for Christmas 2024. I was pretty excited for Metaphor ReFantazio, especially since this was the same team who developed Catherine, but at the time I couldn't get the game at launch. If you played any of the Persona games, then I think you are right at home, as it says elements with nodes like the tire management, social links and social stats, but also says elements with many other at-is titles like the press turn battle system that was introduced in Shin Megami Tensei 3 and onwards, which I absolutely love. Both the player and the enemy's party get a set of turn icons and allows you to get additional turns if you hit an opponent's weakness, or use more if you hit them with an attack they are resisted to, or if they dodge or block it. The enemy can also do the same to you. Certain attacks may require more turn items, which makes the combat system so much fun, and rewarding, requiring you to think and plan out your tactics. The game's customization is fun to experiment with, allowing your party to change classes if that character meets the requirements, and can even transfer some skills to a new class. My favourite was probably the gunner lineup that does a lot of piercing damage from the back row, and the knight, which has a lot of defensive moves. The political story was engaging all the way through, catching many subjects at racism, classes and religion, but does it in the utmost respect. The game has plenty of bleak moments, but there are touches of optimism that you and your party impact throughout the journey. I won't go into too much detail, as I did a 3-hour discussion video with fellow friend and video maker Finistuck months ago, but if you love JRPGs for both gameplay and story, then don't sleep on Metaphor. If you've been on my channel long enough, you know I'm a big Saga fan, and last year I played through a lot of their games, and most of them were part of the Yakuza franchise. My only experience beforehand with the Yakuza series was zero, but I was gifted Yakuza 1 and 2 on the PlayStation 2, and despite the flaws of the very first game, I got obsessed with Kiryu's adventures, even so far as watching the movie based on the first game, which is very messy, and the Amazon TV show, which was a bore to watch. I tried to play Kiwami, but I prefer starting with the original versions if I wanted to get into a franchise, seeing how it started. The first game has a good introduction following Kiryu, who takes the fall for his best friend by covering for his murderer. 10 years have passed and Kiryu now, an ex-Yakuza, gets out of jail, but his best friend and his city he grew up in have changed. 10 million yen has gone missing, and apparently a girl named Haruka is the key to finding it. I felt that I could have spent a bit more time with Nishiki and his relationship with Kiryu, and what drove him into becoming the sinister man he had become, because his transition seemed like it came out of nowhere. That was something the show actually did right. If it wasn't for Zero, then I don't think I would have cared about him as much. The Western version was only in English, and the translators for this particular game got, let's say, creative. It's not good, but it's on the same level as something like Mega Man X4 or the original Symphony of the Night, where it's funny to listen to. If I play it again, I probably would play the Japanese version translated. My biggest issue was the camera, more specifically in fights where you cannot manually move the camera and can only snap back with the L2 button, but I love the fixed camera angle showing how gritty the city of Kamurocho is, and there's a certain charm with the visuals, particularly with the environments. Thankfully, the series got better with Yakuza 2, with much improved combat, manual camera control, less annoying boss fights, and a better story with a stronger villain. After playing the first two, I got the remaster collection on the PlayStation 4 at a cheap price, which includes 3, 4 and 5, but at the moment I've only completed 3 and 4. Yakuza 3 is often considered as one of the weakest, but if this is the weakest game in the franchise, then I've got plenty to look forward to. I think the overall plot is the weakest so far, but I really like a lot of the side characters, with Rikia being my absolute favourite in the story, and the main villain is really entertaining. I enjoyed Kiryu in 2, but I think 3 is where I really cared about him as a character, now being a family man. I enjoyed a lot of the downtime moments with the orphanage and the side stories, but there were moments where it drags on where the actual conflict seems more secondary. The combat is alright, but I didn't enjoy a lot of the bosses that have a lot of health and tend to like to block constantly. I'm not sure which friend told me this, but apparently blocking was more of a remaster issue. Yakuza 4 though is straight up my favourite of the ones I played last year, that I don't really have much of an issue with. Yakuza 4 has 4 playable characters, each with their own playstyles, which might be overwhelming for some and might not like switching from one character to another after spending multiple hours with them. Kiryu pretty much plays the same as the past game. Sadama is this massive powerhouse, if a bit slow. Tanemura can pin his opponents into submission, and my favourite Akiyama has a lot of fast hitting attacks. The boss fights were probably my favourite out of any of them, and I feel this is where the combat became a lot of fun for me. The side content is fun to engage with. I did spend a few times just playing the minigames at billiards. The soundtrack is absolute fire. In fact, I listened to the soundtrack non-stop last year when the Sega Sound team appeared as one of my most viewed artists on Spotify. After playing these 4 games and Yakuza 0, I would say I'm a die-hard Yakuza fan. Another Sega series I got into was the Panzer Dragoon games, playing through both Panzer Dragoon SWI and Saga. My only experience with Panzer Dragoon was the very first game on the Sega Saturn and its remake on the Switch. It's an enjoyable rail shooter that was certainly impressive during the time with a fascinating world inspired by the works of Mobius. SWI is similar to the first game with a bit more to add the replay value with a customizable dragon. Saga is something completely different, changing genres from a rail shooter to an RPG, but adds elements of Panzer Dragoon so well. The combat has something similar to the ABT battle system, but unlike waiting for one bar to attack, you have 3 bars that you can perform 3 actions consecutively if you feel up to the max, which sometimes is better. Some of your special attacks require 2 or 3 bars, so there is always that planning what the best strategy is for the situation. I didn't notice the game having a hit rate as most of my attacks seem to hit. Instead, it uses the past game's rotation grid to find an enemy's weak point. The icon here at the bottom shows a green space where you are safe from enemy attacks, a clear space where the enemy can hit you, and a red space which means danger. However, sometimes it's best to be in the red zone, as some enemies are extremely vulnerable when in that position, which is risky but very rewarding as you are ranked within each battle. The battle is never on standby as enemies will also switch position, so just ID standing by isn't gonna cut it. The higher the rank, the more experience you get, and may get a valuable item. The boss fights are really good, with one that stood out in particular, where I was on a time limit and was so intense when I beat it with only 2 minutes to spare. It was a lot of fun customizing my dragon, able to increase and decrease its status, making future playthroughs unique. You can make your dragon a glass cannon, a speedy dragon that increases the speed of the ATB meter, or make a tank that can take a lot of hits. While the lore was part of the series' appeal, Saga pushes it at the forefront, and it's amazing which makes you think about the ancients, the dragons being seen as some sort of deity or a messenger, who are what Azul is, to somewhat rival the name, and everything to do with the Empire and the Seekers. Despite such a dumb name, Edge is a great protagonist. The story starts out as a revenge quest after the main villain Kramen killed Edge's friends after retrieving Azul hidden in a cave, but becomes so much more, and even though this was the latest game I finished, I'm still thinking about the plot and its world. With how troubled the development was for this game, I was surprised that a lot of FMV cutscenes were voiced. Bear in mind the voice acting is only in Japanese, but it was impressive, especially for a JRPG released in 1998. The game is hard to find now without breaking the bank, so the only way I would recommend it is if you were lucky enough to earn the game back when it came out, or just emulate it. I can see why this is considered a cult classic. I didn't just play a bunch of old Sega games, but I actually got 2 new games by them, one of them being Sonic Racing Crossworlds, which I played back when they did the beta test, and then got it as a gift for Christmas. I played through a majority of racing games from this lineup, with Transform being my absolute favourite, but I thought Team Sonic Racing was a letdown, due to its reliance on Team Synergy to win, which sucks if you were playing with CPUs. Nonetheless, I was cautiously optimistic in trying Crossworlds with a few friends of mine, and it's really fun so far. The team racing mode that was the key component in the previous game is now a fun side activity and brings back the transformative vehicles from Transformed, as well as the air gears from Riders. Even the Riders' original characters make a return, which is cool. Besides the Rider characters, the base roster is what you expect. Unfortunately, the DLC has much yet to be desired, filled with Minecraft, SpongeBob, and a bunch of Nickelodeon characters coming later on. Even though we do have Sega-related characters added and more coming with free updates, I do miss the Sega-ness of the previous games, especially the first All-Stars game. The courses are really fun. There are a mix of tracks from past Sonic titles and complete original ones, my favourites being Mr. Jundle and Kronos Island, and I love how the courses change through each lap, with the second lap taking you to a completely different track. Even the single player Grand Prix can be challenging on the default difficulty, and even the time travelers put up a challenge. I enjoy booting this one up with my friends and will be playing for a good while with many updates coming, hoping we get to see a few more courses. While I was totally optimistic on Crossworlds, I was fully on board with Shinobi Art of Vengeance, ever since it was announced at the Game Awards a couple years ago, especially since it was developed by Cube, who also developed Streets of Rage 4. I don't usually buy games at launch anymore, but with the lower than average price that isn't an indie title, as was my anticipation, this was an exception. Like the earlier titles, you play as Joe Masashi, who must fight an evil organization, but unlike those titles, Art of Vengeance has some cutscenes to give you context on what's going on. If you don't care about the story stuff, you can easily skip them, and you can revisit the stages you already beat in a story track that skips the story entirely, making it highly replayable. I played a good majority of the 2D Shinobi games, but this one feels different, being a longer experience with larger explorable levels, with plenty of hidden secrets and challenges, with some of the later stages being tough as nails. I would say that 1 or 2 levels overstay their welcome a bit, with how large and maze-like some of them are, but for the most part, looking for hidden secrets indulges my curiosity. Combat takes the forefront with your sword being your primary weapon to perform combos, with kunais being demoted to secondary weapons. Joe can learn various skills throughout his adventure, ranging from different combos, amulets that can give you perks to Nimpo spells, my favourites being the Buzzsaw and the Wind Nimpo. Joe feels so good to move around with plenty of mobility options, and are used so well, providing some chance and platform sections. As being a fan of the Shinobi series, I was very happy how Art of Vengeance turned out, and I wish we get to see more larger companies focus on much smaller scale video games in the future. So Masashi wasn't the only ninja that made a return in 2025, as Kerry Ketmo brought back Ninja Gaiden with not just 1, but 3 new games, which I did not play. Unlike my love for Shinobi, I didn't really like Ninja Gaiden. Well, I used the original NES game. However, after talking to a friend and watching them play through the 3D games during my Devil May Cry high, I decided to pick up the Master Collection on Steam for my birthday, which featured Ninja Gaiden Sigma 1, 2, and Razor's Edge. My only experience with the 3D Ninja Gaiden titles was the original Ninja Gaiden 2, when that came out on the Xbox 360, but I remember only getting to the second level. I have never touched it since. The Sigma games are slightly more newcomer friendly than the originals, which while aren't the definitive versions, were a blast. The combat is the main appeal for these games, focusing a lot more on positioning and occasionally using the environment to your advantage, as opposed to performing the most stylish combos, which feels different to any other action games I played. Sigma 1 and 2 have some aggressive enemies that would show no mercy, making sure I was paying attention, not just butting my messing my way through. The main protagonist, Ryu Hayabusa, has quite the kick in Sigma 1 and 2 with his trusty Dragon Sword, Falcon Talons, two-handed sword, and my personal favourite, the Yuna Staff. Performing moves at the famous Inazuma drop feel so satisfying, and absorbing essences to instantly charge up your ultimate technique is an excellent risk-reward mechanic. I also enjoyed the times I was forced to play as Dead or Alive's Ayane. Sadly, the bosses were the low point in this TXN, with some of the most lackluster and oftentimes bullshit bosses in the genre, especially in Razor's Edge. In fact, Razor's Edge was sadly a disappointing climax to an otherwise great trilogy, with a garbage of a plot, lack of essence, and ways to get your health back, poor use of QTEs, frustrating enemies, and one of the worst lineups of bosses I've seen in the genre. Sigma 1 and 2 were an absolute joy, especially the first that had a more connected world, with plenty of places to explore my curiosity. If you love hack and slash games, I at least recommend checking out the Sigma games. I would love to get around to Ninja Gaiden Black. Quite the shift from Ninja Gaiden. Another Code Recollection was one of the games I got for Christmas 2024, but I want to save this one for a cozy night with a few drinks on the side. With the closure of Another Code's original dev team seen over a decade ago, I was shocked that the Another Code Trilogy got remade into one collection for the Switch, but apparently the creators who now work for Arc Systems came back to bring these adventure titles for a new audience, with the second game being the first time to be released officially in America. I enjoyed seeing Nintendo's lesser-known titles get the chance in the spotlight, so I knew I wanted to get my hands on it eventually. Not only were these games more niche than your average Nintendo game, but these two games heavily relied on the console's unique tools, like the DS's dual screen and touchscreen to the Wii's motion controls and speaker, which made it even more surprising that these got remade. So how well are these remakes? To be honest with you, I have no idea, as I've never played the originals, but I did hear a lot of the puzzles were either replaced or removed entirely, and the second game had a lot of story changes. The puzzles weren't that much of a brain tease, and the latter half of the second game reused the same obstacles, which got old pretty fast. Still, the TXN did use the Switch's features, like the gyro control for some of the puzzles, and there were times I used a built-in snapshot feature to take screenshots for later uses. The main appeal for me were the stories following our main lead, Ashley Mizuki Robbins. In the first game, she goes to an island with her aunt after she receives a letter from her father who was presumed dead for so many years. She teams up with a ghost named Dee to find her missing father, solving the mystery of the mansion on the island, and figuring out Dee's past. I really enjoyed their chemistry with one another and the melancholy vibe exploring the mansion. I knew the twist coming a mile away, but I was deeply invested in the plot and Ashley's family struggles. I won't talk much about the second game as it directly ties to the first, but I like seeing more of Ashley's interest, like her passion for music, and having engaged with more characters around her age. She certainly feels like a teenage girl, which might not be something a lot of people would care for, but I think her occasional outburst, along with the decisions she makes her more believable. She is such a great heroine, being one of my favourites I was introduced to last year. If I played Another Code when I was Ashley's age, I would have been obsessed with these games. Parasite Eve was one game I wanted to get around to, but I only got to playing it recently after being recommended by a friend for a Discord challenge during December. Perfectly fitting as the story of Parasite Eve takes place during the Christmas holidays, where our main heroine, Aya Brea, a member of the NYPD, attends the opera with her date, when suddenly a group of people in the audience just happen to spontaneously combust by the leading actress. Aya confronts the actress on stage, who happens to call herself Eve, who flees from the scene. The rest of the game takes place during 6 days hunting down Eve across New York City and finding more about the mitochondria and Aya's connection to Eve. I really enjoyed the cast, from Aya being one of the most badass ladies I've played, as in recent years, to her partner Daniel, who is currently having relationship problems with his son due to his separation with his wife. I was invested in learning about the mitochondria and figuring out Aya's past. I know the FMV cutscenes during the 5th generation of consoles were quite stiff, but I feel there is a certain charm to them. I think the PlayStation 1 was the perfect console to solve the body horror with the stiff animations, enhancing the horror experience. Seeing the man at the Opera House being set on fire, the rat at the window being mutated right in front of my very eyes, 2 people being turned into mush was so grotesque that only the PlayStation to provide. The music is really good, combining opera singing and Yoko Shimomura's compositions that feel different compared to our other works I've experienced before that fits the mood of the game. I recommend giving it a listen. The second half of the 90s had a Resident Evil craze, so plenty of developers decided to hop on the survival horror train, including Squaresoft, who added their JRPG touch. Despite taking a few elements of Resident Evil like the limited ammo for your weapons, Parasite Eve is a JRPG through and through. Actions can be performed by waiting for the active time bar to fill up, but I can freely move around while fighting, making me think when to avoid attacks from enemies. Depending on where the battle begins, you will be forced to fight in that area, whether that be in a large room or in a tight space. I found Aya to be a bit slow for my liking, and I found it difficult to avoid attacks when battles were in tight spaces, though using the haste spell certainly helped Aya's movement speed. I had fun with the combat system, and the weapon customization is really cool to mess around with. I did forget about weapon customization until about 2 or 3 hours into the game, but it was cool transferring stats and bonus effects from one weapon to another. If you want a sword JRPG, then I highly recommend trying out Parasite Eve. Back in 2023, I played through the very first Ape Escape, which I absolutely adored, but it took me a while to hop on the other 2 games. Both 2 and 3 play similar to the first game, with the goal of capturing a certain amount of monkeys in each stage, with various gadgets to use, but all 3 are some of the most fun 3D platformers I played, with so much charm and personality. With the help of the PlayStation 2, the animations are a lot more creative, with unique kinds of monkeys defined with their own patterns. Ape Escape 2 introduces the Monkey 5 as bosses, making the boss lineup way more than the first game, with my favourite being Yellow Monkey. They are what you expect from the genre, being rather simple, but I really like their personalities. I usually heard from fans that 2 is the weakest in the trilogy, and yeah, it probably is, with a less distinct theme, and the soundtrack not being as memorable as the other 2, but I enjoyed the vehicle and the mech sections, with 100% completion being a lot of fun to do. Ape Escape 3 has such a cool theme, with each stage being set around a TV studio, which not only makes references to certain films, but you also see the monkeys hold TV equipment, and even allow you to film them performing their own sort of hits. New to 3 was able to play as either a boy or a girl, and able to transform into different personas that give you different abilities, such as a Maid's Knight that can protect them from enemies in front of them, or the Wild West Kid, which can fire projectiles and open switches from a distance. These costumes allow more unique ways to capture monkeys. 3 also introduces one of the best mini-games in any video game, with a spoof of Metal Gear Solid, where you play as a monkey dressed like Solid Snake to save the actual Snake. It's basically a Metal Gear Solid campaign, which is so cool. Both games are incredibly fun, with Ape Escape 3 now being in my top 10 PlayStation 2 games of all time. However, we aren't done yet with monkey-centric games, as I've got one more game to talk about. The Nintendo Switch 2 made its debut last year, and one of the new games that was introduced for the new console was a brand new Donkey Kong game, and in the first time since DK64, a brand new 3D Collectathon. When Donkey Kong Bananza was announced, I jumped out of my chair. I'm a huge DK fan, and with the Mario Odyssey team who made the best Mario game to date, I knew I wanted to hop on. I don't have a Switch 2, and at the moment I don't necessarily want one, but I was lucky enough to play Bananza around the time it was released, thanks to one of my siblings. If you love Mario Odyssey, then I think you would like DK just as much, with plenty of golden bananas to collect in a dozen sandboxes to explore. The difference is, instead of an Italian plumber who can perform acrobatic feats and able to capture various enemies, you are playing a large ape who can climb on most surfaces without the loss of stamina and can break most terrains with his bare fist. You can even grab a piece of the floor or wall and use it as a platform for an extra jump, or use it to surf around muddy floors. It was fun to see where you can go with these handful of movements. I can see why this was a Switch 2 exclusive, as the game could tug with all breakable objects you can destroy. And even on the Switch 2, the frame rate does drop a bit when there is too much on screen. The camera is mostly fine, but then due to how you can dig practically anywhere, it can be hard to see where you are going sometimes. Even with the runtime, I never got bored due to how much new things were introduced within each level. I wasn't big on DK's new design at first, but it grew on me as I was playing the game. I'm not sure if I prefer Bananza or Ape Escape 3, but I had an absolute blast playing through both of them. I don't think Bananza alone would convince anyone to pick up a Switch 2, but I'm at least glad I got to play it. What are some of your favourite games that you played last year, and are there any games you are looking forward to this year?